I'm delighted to end today's program with Pietro Bartolo. I heard him first on a panel, I think by the New York Council of Churches, was that? We're not sure, he must speak. I was very inspired both by the dedication of the ministry that you talk about and by your very broad, thorough knowledge about the issue of housing. And I think I want to remind you of what Reverend Park said today about the difference between personal theology and local theology and global theology. Pietro is a member of a Catholic lay community, and
Sorry, we can hear you.
I want to say that I've learned from you, and that I hope you look forward to learning as we share ecumenically in the theology that we share, but also in the way that each of us in our groups practice our theology. Welcome.
Thanks. Sure, yeah, let's make sure all change these areas that are I move it over. Tell me when I'm
In front of this camera.
other side. Well, here.
Yes.
All right.
Let me.
Yeah, no, take your time.
Hold on one moment in the Zoom. We are trying to make sure you can hear. Give us 1 second.
Oh,
Until 3.
how's that?
No, it's not on. The mic is on red.
Mike's not.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear us? It's just, I just saw the thing flash. Default microphone changed.
Can you hear yet?
I can hear.
How is the sound now online?
How's the online sound?
Somebody needs to turn to mute their mic.
No, I'm asking them about the sound.
Can you hear us?
I don't know.
No, it's coming out of there.
Okay.
Most of our audience is online.
Yeah, I see that. I can see the chat kind of being on. Evan can hear. That's positive.
Yeah, I'm checking it. Why don't you talk a minute so they can tell if they can hear?
Okay. I'll just give my general hello. That's awesome. So thanks again very much for inviting me. As mentioned, my name is Pietro Bartoli. It's an Italian name, but I'm originally from New York. I was born in, yeah, exactly. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Evan, also for controlling the PowerPoint. As you also mentioned, and this is actually interesting, the next slide, I wanted to just underline this fact, how much I appreciate coming here as a Catholic. This is a quote from St. Pope John the 23rd. Cathedral often takes inspiration from. Pope John the 23rd was stationed in Venice, in Istanbul, kind of across the world in the early 20th century, and was asked when he became cardinal and then Pope, what's going on here? What are you doing? And very simply, he said, I prefer to focus on what unites us than rather than divides. And that's the same kind of motto, same spirit that the Cathedral tries to embody, and I'm very honored that it seems to me at least that you're doing the same thing by welcoming me here. So I'm really grateful for that. Everyone can hear me okay? Yeah, it seems like we're doing okay because the thing seems to be following along. Okay, so I wanted to start with that point of ecumenical work because that's really what I wanted to focus on today. Obviously, I was asked to come here to talk about housing and homelessness, which I will, and I'm going to be quite technical about it and quite historical, at least as best I can. But the thrust and the reason for all of that is a really deep-seated faith, and it's something that I think we all share here. And the reason for me being technical is not because I want to skip over the faith part, but because I think that if we want to be real active participants, citizens in New York City and wherever it is that we live, we need to know the technical stuff as well. So maybe I'm taking the deep faith that we all have for granted, but I think I'm justified in doing so. So this, of course, is, I think, where we start. This is exactly the question that, or the invitation I think we all have, and it's the invitation that the community of DGO takes to inspire us to work with the homeless and the marginalized across New York City. So let me just give a quick outline of what I'm going to run through today in the time that I have. I'm happy to kind of go short also and facilitate more conversation afterward if that helps. Also, if anything is too tedious or actually is something you already know, stop me. That's fine. And we can jump around. I won't be offended. I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to have participation. So the first thing we'll do is I'll just introduce the community of San Pietro, where I come from. So this community that has a bit of a weird name, but I'm hoping that you'll learn something. Then I'll kind of shift over to the technical side of things. I'll do a historical overview of homelessness in New York City. I'll try to get as close as I can to the current situation, and if I don't get as close as we need to, then we'll talk about that in the question section. I'll then go back to San Pietro and talk about how it is that we are specifically addressing homelessness, or at least what it is that we do for the city. And then my hope is that that gets us towards the natural kind of conclusion and responses that anyone can do, should be encouraged to do. And then general questions about the theme at all. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Any other issues? Okay. All right. So we can talk about San Pietro. As Miriam mentioned, the community of San Pietro is a Catholic lay association dedicated to life in friendship with the poor. In this context, association is a formal ecclesial society authorized by the Holy See of baptized persons who devote themselves to a particular charism. We can think, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Catholic setting, the Jesuits or the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Hearts, these orders of religious, same thing exists for lay people. We generally call them associations. San Pietro is one of these. We're a little bit different than that, but I'll get into it. We were born in 1968, and I'll use community San Pietro, community of San Pietro, kind of all interchangeably. I'm not referring to the same thing. I was born in 1968 in Rome by a high schooler named Andrea Riccardi, who in the 60s, in the spirit of Vatican II, picks up the gospel, which at the time was very strange for a Catholic to do, and starts reading it. And he goes, oh, this is actually something I can take seriously. Something like my friends and I can actually do something about. So he gathers starts with small group of high schoolers in Rome. They start with a prayer before school, reflection, and then a service that they call the popular school, now morphed into what's called the School of Peace, which is where I'm actually coming from right now, in the Bronx, which is really fun. That at the time was a after-school program and language program in the slums of Rome, which at the time had a very large Roma community. And since then, the community has just grown, always with the same principle at heart, which is that it's possible to be a Christian today, one, and that to do so means to love and to serve the poor as your brothers and sisters. Here's where I get a little bit into San Pietro specifically. We don't have any we don't take vows. We are 99% lay. There is a confraternity of priests, but otherwise we're all lay people. The president has to be lay. The structure is all lay. All of us have day jobs outside of being in the community, so there are no formal positions. And participation is also based entirely on your commitment to a free and gratuitous service within the community. So the School of Peace, the service to the elderly, service to the homeless, and participation in our communal prayer life. There's no, like I said, no sign up, no vow, no nothing. It's just, if you decide that this is the way you want to live your life, great. If you don't, that's fine too. We believe that the Spirit is heard better in community. So we gather regularly for prayer, like I said, in our respective cities, and also globally and regionally, regularly for reflection, which we hear the word to continue growing in discipleship. The community is now present in over 70 countries, and it seeks out the marginalized and wonders what it means to be close to them, friends with them, and is convinced that in doing that, in building these personal relationships, we're building a better world. Unfortunately, there are many universal ills around the world, right? The elderly is a problem around the world. Abandoned children happens around the world. Prisoners being mistreated, of course, it happens around the world. And of course, the homeless happens around the world. So while we are present in over 70 countries, many of the services overlap. But the spirit is always the same, like I said, and as mentioned in the previous slide, we're always inspired by the Good Samaritan, which says, okay, you find your neighbor, you find him injured, you find him hurt, you respond. And similarly, in drawing from the Bible, we are inspired by the woman with the two mites, which says, no one's too poor, no one's too old, no one's too sick, no one's too poor, no one's too rich, no one's too tired. No one has a reason not to do anything. Everyone can do something. So we try to cross these boundaries and seek communion where we are. This next slide here is a picture of the community in Rome, to where we've grown now. So this is Pope Francis meeting with the community in Rome at Palazzo Migliori, which you may have heard of was a former palace, now converted into a homeless shelter, right in the outskirts of St. Peter's Square. It's now run by Sant'Egidio. Pope Francis kind of turned it over to us. And 25 people now live there full time. And this is on opening day. He came and had dinner with us all there. The service to the homeless, in particular in Rome, started with a woman named Modesta Valenti, who was sleeping, like many of us have experienced here in New York City, in the train station. It's in the 70s. And her story is particularly tragic because she was sick one night. Ambulance was called for her. And the ambulance refused emergency services because she was covered in fleas. She died that night with no one to care for her. And so Sant'Egidio, again, inspired by the Good Samaritan, thought, this can't stand. We can't do this. We have to be at least close to them. So little by little, we started visiting the station there. I obviously was still around, but the same spirit continues alive today. The Mensa is what then grew out of that. It's a soup kitchen, first soup kitchen in Rome, and just our inspiration. This quote here on the bottom, that some of you maybe recognize it. This is from Dorothy Day, who is a great inspiration for all of us here in New York City. Founder of the Catholic Worker, and one of the first people to address really modern homelessness, and we'll get to this, in such a way of faith. So, that being said, we're going to move ahead now really to talk about homelessness and how it developed in New York City and the history of it and how we got to where we are. As I was mentioning, I think it's really important to start with history. This number, though, is the first number that we need to know. I said we're going to go to history, but we're actually going to start from the beginning and then jump back, because I just want us to know where we are today. 90,000 is the approximate number of homeless individuals in New York City tonight. It's a rough estimate. It's as best we can, but it's what we can. This number, 85,247, is the number of people, for sure, that slept in a shelter on October 1st. It's an enormous number. It's an enormous number, and it's been trending up, unfortunately. Just last year, around June, so just over a year ago, we were at about 40,000. Obviously, there's been a swell of migrants, and they've taken up quite a lot of room in the shelters, and they're in and out, but there are many, many factors at play. We can go to the next slide. Of those 85,000, approximately 2/3 are in families, which leaves us with this number, 29,653 children. Those are people under the age of 18 who live in New York City shelters. That, of course, leaves us with about 25,000 single adults. Why do I start here? The reason is just to kind of give a better picture of homelessness. I think when we think of homelessness, we kind of think of people who sleep on the street, who are in the subway, who are begging, and of course, that's relevant, it's important, we need to talk about them too. But the two of them fit together. And any sort of advocacy, any kind of service, any kind of policy that we think about in terms of housing affects both, and we need to think of them as a unit, even though the experience of homelessness, people experiencing homelessness is now the phrase that tends to be used, is really quite varied. When we do think about street homeless individuals, unsheltered individuals, the number that's kind of publicly shared is around 4,000 people, which is still an extraordinary amount. It's also most likely quite a low estimate. The way those numbers are counted is called the Hope Count, which is something that happens a couple times a year in which volunteers, through various churches, nonprofits, etc., go out in the middle of the night and are kind of assigned sort of sections of the city, and they do their best to count how many people do we see, and then they estimate. But it really is a guess. So we can go back now in time. So it wasn't always this way, right? Homelessness has been tied to poverty forever. It's pretty obvious, we know that. But poverty and homelessness are not directly causal. We're going to go as far back as 1900. I'm sorry that I'm not going back further. I'm sorry also that this history is relatively narrow. Obviously, it's a much broader history than I can cover in 25 minutes. Just to give you an example though, in 1900, 2/3 of the city's population lived in tenements. We're talking about extreme poverty. We're talking about 2.3 million people. I'm not going to go ahead and say this at all a good thing, right? The tenements were awful, the conditions were awful, people died all the time, but it wasn't homelessness. And it's worth thinking about, well, why did we tried to solve the tenements problem. Okay, maybe we've solved that slightly, and now we have this homelessness problem. What's the trajectory here? Even the Hoovervilles, the 1920s, the Depression era, right? Where people think, oh my God, people are living in the streets all over the place. Even in New York City, we had people living in Central Park. Primary sources from the time talk about scores of people living in Central Park. That's 20, 68. There were 2,000 total homeless people in New York City in 1929. Just to give you an idea, we're now around 100,000. It's a totally different thing. The existence of what we would call homelessness starts around the 1970s, and the root causes are in the early years. So what happens, basically? One, and this is the important thing, criminalized poverty. This is a phrase that maybe some of you are familiar with, and misled good intentions. What do I mean by that? Basically that there were changes in policy, health, justice, housing, you name it, happening at the same time as rising costs, rising inequality of wealth that made housing inaccessible, put people in dire conditions, they needed assistance, there were fewer resources, then there was less empathy for them. That left them to be more vulnerable, which put them in difficult conditions, which put them in worse conditions, which made the city less empathetic, and lo and behold, a vicious cycle that continues until today. You could say maybe it's improved slightly recently, but really it continues. So we can continue this. So we can start from the tenements of the 1920s, and we move pretty quickly, as people realized that tenements were so dangerous, to something called the SROs. Are people familiar with SROs? Yeah, I think we're occupancy. Okay. So these became really, really popular throughout the 50s and 60s. In the 1950s, SROs made up 10% of the entire housing stock for New York City, which is an extraordinary number, considering what's possible today. But those were usually popular with, those tend to be popular with single working men, folks who are working class people, returning soldiers, wartime laborers, migrants from the South, new immigrants. This is the ideal form of housing that was kind of developed at the time to welcome migrants, basically. Same idea, people who needed new places to live. Obviously, the conditions of SROs started to worsen too, and this is where I kind of get into this issue of good intentions. We can stay on this slide for a while. There was a massive fight against SROs because the conditions had gotten so bad. And so from the 50s to the 70s, the city undertook a pretty intense policy of decreasing the stock of SROs. Here you have an example of the sort of architectural changes that were happening in SRO units. So here you have these just 4 units in one bathroom, and this becomes a 2-bedroom unit that probably houses 1 person, maybe in their studio. These townhouses have become really luxe walk-through apartments. This happens all over the place. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. So I'm trying to pull it up here. By 1985, so in the course of 30 years, over 100,000 units have been destroyed. Just remember, the number we started with of homeless individuals, 100,000. So there's a pretty clear correlation. And I think it's reasonable to say, okay, no, we understand why that happened, right? We understand that SROs were in really dire straits. We understand that the drive behind it was positive. But as I'll kind of show later, the city divested, made it difficult for the SROs to continue, and didn't come up with any alternatives. Likewise, rent control, rent stabilization laws, which had protected an enormous amount of housing in New York City, and not just for the poor, people of working class, even people of upper class backgrounds were living in rent stabilized or rent controlled even apartments, that was systematically done. The first act of deregulation that my next step gets to was in 1951. That continues through the 1960s. 1969, rent stabilization kind of comes back because we realized how many mistakes we were making. But then in the 70s, it gets wiped out again, and basically has to come back until the last couple of years there have been some talk about reestablishing rent protection, especially right now. There's a bill that's being discussed in the legislature, New York State legislature, called Good Cause Eviction. And there were some changes in the late 2010s that reintroduced at least some level of rent stability and protection. But across the board, and I don't have to tell you, we're all here in New York, rents have skyrocketed. Does anyone by chance know what the rent is for average one bedroom in New York City?
In Manhattan?
No, New York City as a whole.
3,000.
One bed.
One bed.
1,800.
One bed's about 1,800.
4233.
What?
Average in New York City.
Holy cow.
So of course Manhattan is much higher, but that means that it goes higher and 4,200, yeah, $33. It's an insane number. It's an insane number. Then we have this next level, this slide here. Does anyone guess what these are? These pictures?
10
No, go back for a second, sorry.
projects.
Nope,
Barracks.
nope. I mean, yes, no.
It looks like a motel.
This is a far more psychiatric institution.
Oh.
So between 1965 and 1979, the state and the federal government across the board undertook a massive policy of reducing the amount of psychiatric beds in the country. So the number in New York State falls from 85,000 psychiatric beds to 27,000. So we're talking about a 68% decline. And again, the idea was, oh, these psychiatric hospitals are awful. And they were. People were not being treated, people were being ignored, they were being shut away by their families. They were terrible. But the idea was, okay, we have to shut these down, and we're going to reintegrate into community facilities. Guess what didn't happen? Investment in community facilities. So, what happened? People who were left out to dry ended up in New York City, where the places that they were supposed to be living in, the SROs, the affordable housing, nope, those were all gone. So, what do you think is going to happen? Kind of what we were talking about earlier with youth, we heard about incarceration basically steps up, and that becomes the alternative. Great solution we have. Third, and kind of last kind of tip of the barrel, straw that broke the camel's back, whatever you want to call it, and it's definitely not the most important, but it's another element, is the drug crisis. Particularly important here in New York City in the 80s and the 90s. But we have these two, three, four compounding factors. An increasingly vulnerable population. Obviously, certain populations were targeted intentionally, certain populations were intentionally not given the help they needed. Like, of course, this is what's going to happen. And drug use becomes both a reason and a symptom of homelessness, right? A reason, of course, that we've seen also now with opioids, and it's not the primary reason, but it's not uncommon to move from drug use to job loss to housing loss. But more common is actually a symptom, and I'll share later, there's plenty of resources that show this now, that the majority of homeless individuals who have a substance abuse problem develop that substance abuse problem in the street. So it's not that, it does happen that people use drugs and end up in the street. The majority of people, though, end up in the street, end up in terrible, deplorable conditions, and what do we expect from them when they're not doing anything else? How on earth are they supposed to survive when no one's extending a friendly hand, and for a couple of bucks they can get an escape? It makes pretty sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So this kind of all pushes us towards modern homelessness. Then we have one more step, which is Callahan v. Carey. Does anyone know about this legal case, Callahan v. Carey? It's totally okay. Does anyone know about the right to shelter?
Yeah.
Okay, so the right to shelter. Callahan v. Carey is the legal case that establishes the right to shelter in New York City in 1979. It begins in 1981 is when it is fully effective. Throughout the 80s, that's expanded to include women and children and families and so on. So we get to the point of today, which I'm sure many of you have heard about also because it's in the news regarding our newly arrived New Yorkers. The right to shelter covers anybody who is physically present in New York City, regardless of immigration status, of health condition, of age, of whatever, you name it. We are obligated to house people. The issue with this, and this is really my personal opinion, although it's shared by some, is that like the issue of the mental institutions, the city has been distracted by the right to shelter and has invested an enormous amount of money, because it's been mandated to, into shelters, and totally divested from public housing, permanent supportive housing, any other supportive mechanism. just to give you a rough estimate, or kind of not rough, but specific estimate, in 2022, DHS, that's the Department of Homeless Services budget, was 2.8 billion. It was 2.1 billion in 2023, or this year, and next year is proposed to be about 2.4. That doesn't cover, of course, the exceptional funds that are being used in these emergency settings to house the recently arrived folks. But NYCHA and the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, over these last 10 years, up until now, these last 10 years, has averaged 1.6 billion. So, there's a bit of a disconnect there. For the cost of 2.4 billion, we've allowed people to live in these sort of conditions for the most part, when we could have instead invested in public housing and all sorts of other forms of housing. We haven't. Fortunately, new budgets have boosted that to about 2.5 billion for housing over the next 10 years, but realistically, that's really still tremendously short. That's really, most experts estimate, just enough to maintain the current housing stock we have, not to develop any more. I think that number of the DHS budget is also worth pausing on for a second, because it's a big number. I mean, $2.5 billion is not chump change, especially when we're talking about 100,000 people. It works out to a pretty decent amount of money per person. But, and I don't want to get into this too much, but the allocation of these funds is ridiculous. Just one little story here, personal story. As part of the community of San Pietro, one of the things we do, and we'll talk about this more later, is personal accompaniment to people. So we really make an effort to meet people on the street, become their friends, and be there for them throughout their lives, from the street, hopefully permanent housing. What we have noticed, and many people know this anecdotally and of course statistically as well, is that the turnover rates in most of these agencies is enormous. It's incredibly fast. On average, in a year, people have 4 or 5 case managers. It's an insane number. Yes. Why does that happen? Well, one of the things that we've experienced personally, and I'm telling you really personally, I'll tell her story later, Michelle. Michelle is a breaking ground client, my friend, but she's a breaking ground client. Michelle has had 2 caseworkers over the last year, both of, among others, but 2 of them, who themselves, who are tasked with helping her get housing, live in a homeless shelter. Breaking ground is not paying all of its own case managers enough to not live in homeless shelters for the cost of $2.4 billion. Think about the city that we're living in, right? So we can move forward here, just to do a quick recap of the trends that we're dealing with. So this, again, really rough. We started with unaffordable housing. Homelessness is primarily a housing problem. I've mentioned other things, but I really need to stress primarily a housing issue. We add on the health crisis, the deinstitutionalization of the drug epidemic. We add on top of that a general tendency, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, of the city to kind of withdraw from social services, cut budgets. Fortunately, and again personally here, the current administration seems to be moving in that direction as well. And then we force the city to become a reactionary city instead of a proactive city with the right to shelter. Again, I'm not in favor, just to be clear, of eliminating the right to shelter, but I think it's important to understand where it plays into the current situation. I'm going to have to kind of go quickly now because I want to leave time for time, and I'm sorry that I've been kind of rambling. But this is the present situation, and you can go ahead and just kind of slide through. This is generally the process from going from the street to housing, and I'll share this with everybody later so you can look it over other resources as well. But generally the process is you're either engaged by street outreach or you present yourself, and then you're moved into transitional housing, then you're moved into stabilization housing, and then you're moved into permanent housing. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, this is that, so again, we'll get into this more. This is more of the actual details of the actual organization, so keep going, Evan. Again, one more. These are the forms of shelter and housing that we have across the city. They vary from that picture we had earlier of the kind of large congregate centers. You might have something like this where you have just bed. The city, fortunately, has been moving away from that into something called the safe haven model, which maybe some of you are familiar with. Those tend to be smaller facilities, or they're large facilities, but smaller kind of clusters. So you might have 1 bed in the best scenario. Usually you have 5 or 6. They have less curfew, they have less regulations, and they kind of shift towards the housing first model, which is we welcome you first, and we try to help you get the help you need. We keep going. Again, this is all we share. This is a picture recently, don't go back, of the 30th Street intake shelter. It's right by Bellevue. This is the main shelter that all single men must go through, unless they are, for some reason, exceptionally brought outside the system. If they want to get through, this is what it's like on an average night. You can imagine why people don't exactly want to show up there. We can go to the next one. This now is these sort of halfway settings where people are trying to call these safe havens, but really they're not. So you might get 2 beds, then a half wall, then 2 more beds, and a half wall. So you have a room like this, but it's sort of subdivided. And the city likes to say these are safe havens. Realistically, they're not that different because you still have all the issues concerning overlap and the lack of privacy. Go to the next one. This is difficult to see, but this is the Andrews, which is a safe haven run again by Breaking Ground. It's on the Bowery, way downtown, and it's one of the, funnily enough, favorite places for many people to go because it's all single rooms. Funnily enough, though, when I walk in, I think many of you had the same reaction. You walk in there and you would think to yourself, this place is a prison. You can't see it, but the way this works is that this is one major hallway. We have to think that this here, we're saying this Bowery, so this is the window, and then that would be the back of the block. The hallway goes straight down the middle. There's one window here at the front, a large window, and along the side are 4x8 plywood sheets that make up the wall, 1 by 1 by 1, and they form little cubicles, probably no bigger than one of these tables here, just enough space for a twin-size bed, maybe a foot on either side, and some shelving. Those sheets go up 8 feet tall, and then up here, you really can't see it, is chicken wire. That's what separates the people. So you have air passing through, that's air ventilation, but the physical separation is just this plywood. That's one of the best safe havens. It's a single room, people feel that they can close the door behind them, they can just go to sleep, whatever happens, they're private. But just to give you an idea of what it is that we're talking about when we say, go to the shelter system, go in there, help yourself out. I wouldn't want to go, right? You go to the next place. This is realistically what happens to folks who try to go through the system. It's supposed to take 6 to 9 months. If it takes 2 years, you're lucky. There are never enough beds. There's constantly turnover in the staff, constantly missing documentation. The staff don't know how to find it. You follow up on that, and they don't actually follow up with you. They don't go with you to your appointments. That's something that San Pietro is very intentional about. Again, about being friends. We try to really be there for you, like any friend would. If you're having trouble going to the DMV, well, okay, I'll go. I'll take the time off. Let's go there and make sure you actually know what you're talking about. You know what you're asking for. And let's do this. That tends to not happen. We can keep going. So, a little bit more about San Pietro. San Pietro, as I said, our service began in 2011 here in New York City. It just began with a couple of us, at the time 3 or 4, who got a pot of soup and just walked into the Grand Central Terminal with a literal pot of soup and just started doling it out. That didn't last very long. And so now we actually go have the thermal bag and pre-packed. And we do about 400 meals across the week. We do Tuesday nights and Sunday mornings. This is us in the middle of COVID, so we didn't stop. We haven't missed a single Tuesday since 2011. Pandemic, manifestations, protests, police, elections, doesn't matter. Because we believe that friends are there. So every Tuesday since 2011, at least one of us has been present at Grand Central. We covered about the Midtown area. And our style is one of openness to the invitation that the person in front of us asks of us. Like the Good Samaritan who said, okay, I have a person in front of me who clearly is in need of a rest, of a bed, of someone who will care for them, that's what I'll give. Same idea here. Someone's in need of a meal? Great, we'll do that. But more importantly, we feel that people who are experiencing homelessness are alone. And what they need is a friend. What they need is someone who will listen to them, listen to their story, take them seriously, and try to care for them as they are. We can keep going. You know, I have some sources here, but I'm going to keep going. So this is Michelle. Oh, go back. I just want to give you a picture. I'm not going to skip George, we'll get to that if we have time. This is Michelle, this was last week actually. We do an annual retreat with folks now from the street, and we just take them away to Warwick, it's upstate New York, and we do a weekend getaway. Spend some time together, give people a different experience for a weekend. Michelle's actually very lucky. Finally, after 3 years in the shelter system, she now has her own place. It is all the crap I talked about SROs earlier. It's an SRO. It's a formerly converted hotel on 23rd Street. She doesn't love it, understandably. It's not in the best conditions, but it's hers. She has a voucher now, and she's trying to get back to work. She's getting all her documentation in order, and hopefully in a year she can move out and be independent again. But it goes just to show you the importance of maintaining the right kind of housing for all sorts of different kind of people, and understanding that there's a reason that certain kinds of housing exist, and allowing people's lived experience to kind of judge what we think is right and wrong. Now I'll skip forward again because of time. All right, so what comes next for everybody else? I think number one, again, is really to be a friend. Obviously, the experience of homelessness and the experience of poverty here in Queens is maybe different than it is in Midtown Manhattan. The people you meet might be different depending on where you live, but everyone can be a friend to somebody in need, whatever their housing conditions. Maybe you see the same person every day when you cross the street. You don't have to give money, just say hi, check on them, get to know their name. There's a guy now, I've seen that 3 times, it's really funny, his name is Water. He lives on the trains, and he just goes up and down the trains, he sells water. But he had a chance to just say hi. I recognize you, I see you. That makes a difference. I can't tell you how many times we've had folks who tell us about their experiences with the outreach workers, the city branded outreach workers. No, I don't blame them either, but they'll send us different teams every day, and the different team every time. Hey, are you interested? No. Yes. No. Yes. No. Back and forth. Hey, are you interested? Yes. Okay. Fill out this paperwork. We'll come back to you next week. No one comes back. 2 weeks later, someone else comes back. Hey, are you interested? Fill out this paperwork. Of course, that there's a cultivation of distrust among the population when it comes to the city. So, become a friend is absolutely number one. And the second is to, as part of being a friend, listen. Be available to let your life be moved by the Spirit. Pope Francis, and again, I'm being a good Catholic here, Pope Francis has said that when we let our lives be moved by the poor, they become wonderfully complicated. That's exactly the sort of sentiment we feel. Right? Let your life be enriched by the presence of somebody else. Empty yourself for that other person who is asking something of you, and you'll find how much deeper your life can get. So that's what I mean by go out of your way. The rest are fairly self-explanatory. I don't need to tell you to advocate. That's why you're here. The accompanying to appointments is just something that we do. I just want to stress how exceptional it is for someone on the street to have somebody who listens to them and who does what they ask because they're asking. Not because it's a good reason, not because they throw the right application, but just because I asked you as a friend, please do this for me. We do that with our friends, we do that with our family, we can do it with somebody else as well. As much as you can, also inform yourself about what the system is. I'm happy to share more resources as well. But no, if you're calling 311 for somebody and saying, go to the shelter system, they're ending up at 30th Street, right? So explain to them maybe, or be able to explain it, or warn what the conditions are, or say, I'm still going to be there for you. Contacting the service agency, all the rest. That's all. We can keep going. And I think that's pretty much it. I want to leave time for questions. I hope I did. I think that's it. I think Evan's not moving to the next slide because it isn't the next slide. Exactly. So we'll end it there. So we'll end it there, but just to say that I think everyone has the capacity to help someone in homelessness, and if there are any questions that I can ever answer now or moving forward, I'm happy to. Thank you.
Can anyone volunteer for the Tuesday night?
Anyone is welcome to come anytime. We're a Catholic organization, but non-Catholics, non-religious people, whatever, can come anytime, and as many times or as few times as they want. Just reach out to us. I'll give you my cell phone number personally, and you can feel free to circle that with whoever you want. The only thing we ask, kind of like friends, is just let us know. Don't just show up, because that kind of makes things difficult for us and for the people who we're trying to meet. If you want to come once a month, once every 6 months, that's fine. You want to come every week, that's fine too. The more people come, the more we can do so. And Sunday nights, Sunday mornings as well. Sure.
Yeah, I've seen these miniature houses. They do a housing development.
Yeah, the tiny houses.
Like 200 square feet
Yep.
or something like this. And I was thinking, those things, if they're arranged, it's sort of like a trailer park, but have those buildings where you could actually start to have a community.
Sure.
And yet people would still have their privacy.
Sure.
I mean, much better than either warehousing
Absolutely.
or coming to a shelter and you can't really do apartments because, especially not New York, it's way too expensive. But I'm hoping that maybe they'll do something like that in some park.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like Prospect Park, or, you know, one of the parks that built some of these things where people can actually have a place of their own. I remember one thing I saw where the most incredible thing was they gave the person a key.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's
so they could lock a door.
Yeah.
You know, and have something of their own. The other thing that someone told me, and I was going to try to do, if you give a homeless person something,
yeah,
ask them if it would be okay for you to ask their name.
Yeah.
So you recognize them as a person. That's not, you know. So if they're giving you something, or you give them something, you give them $12 or a bottle of water or something, would you mind telling me your name?
Yeah, I think those are both great points. About the housing, right, the size of housing, so it's a similar idea theoretically to the SRO. Enough space that's yours, enough for you to live in, it's not an issue, but it's yours. As you said, in New York City, it's tough to build, especially apartments. I would say two things about that, though. One is that people tend to think that building in general, affordable housing, especially, but building in general, needs to be massive, 300 units. It doesn't have to be that. You know, when we're talking about the shift from a single flat level town, or single home or whatever it is, to 5 stories, you've quintupled the amount of housing. But it's still not an enormously large structure. There are a lot of different creative ways of cultivating community. A lot of the SROs, in Harlem, there used to be a lot of these, especially, you know, the old beautiful Harlem townhouses that are 3 or 4 stories tall. Those used to house easily a dozen people. And a dozen is a very manageable number, and it's enough where the people internally can form their own community. They don't need 30,000 staff members to control them. But 12, there are a lot of really creative ways of doing that. Tiny homes is definitely one of them. The second thing I would say about the name, one of the things that we do kind of as a best practice, although we don't call them that, is we just give our names. And then you'll see that people are like, oh, you're Pietro, great, I'm James, whatever. And they also like the authority or the responsibility that comes with being able to offer your name freely. So I think those are great things. Yeah.
There's a proposal on the table in Albany to build more low-income housing, because what we see now, they're building a lot of houses which is not affordable.
Right.
They're sitting there and nobody can afford to rent. So we just put a proposal on the table in Albany 2 weeks ago waiting for the governor to sign off on that, because there's a lot of wasteland that they can use that to build low-income housing.
No, it's really important. So there have been some shifts, fortunately, again, in the last 10, 15 years that have increased the amount of affordable housing that's regularly being built. It's still not nearly enough, obviously, and it's actually probably not keeping up with the poverty in New York City. The governor had tried to push through a pretty aggressive bill a couple months ago. That unfortunately failed. And so yes, pushing for affordable housing across the board is definitely an important project. I would add, though, that I think it's not worth, it's important also to realize the value of housing across the board, even in a free market setting. It's not ideal, of course, but the more housing in general we have, the prices will at least marginally start to go down. So encouraging that wherever you can is also a positive. Yeah, well, one thing that's worth noting, the city has recently just changed, the mayor's administration did just put forward a change in zoning, and I don't remember exactly what the other regulations around it is, but they've changed them significantly that should allow for increased building and construction, especially now in low-rise areas of the city. That'll then go before the city council, so it's not actually going to be implemented probably until 2025, assuming it all goes well. But I would say concretely, if that's something that you're interested in supporting, call your local council and participate in. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've learned so much. Our time is up. Thank you, everybody who came here to Forest Hills and those who are watching us online. And some of you aren't watching right now, but you will in the future. So welcome, everybody. Let us close in prayer. Dear God, you are our home. And yet we rely so much on the walls and roofs, the sinks and water, the beds, the chairs, the comfort of heat in the winter and cool air in the summer. There is so much that we take for granted because we have it. So we pray as we end this day that you will make our hearts sensitive to those who do not have what we have, that you will give us courage to advocate, to get up every Tuesday, get out, to speak to those who we feel uncomfortable speaking to helping those that seem to be a world apart from us. Help us be your hands, and may we be, as a community, home for the world around us. Lead us back to our daily lives and our weekend worship. May we give ourselves up to you and to your ministry. In the name of Jesus Christ, crucified Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Go with peace.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, guys, all of you who participated. Thank you all. Have a nice weekend. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, young people.